Hollywood in the 1980s wasn't just big hair and blockbuster fun. Behind the scenes, studios were panicking. Test audiences walked out. Critics freaked out. Censors slammed the brakes. And just like that, some wild, risky movies were buried or butchered beyond recognition. But here's the twist. Time didn't kill them. It saved them. Tonight, you're cracking open a vault Hollywood hoped would stay locked forever. These are 10 censored 80s movies that were once considered too dark, too weird, or just too dangerous for you to see. So, which forbidden film will surprise you the most? 10. Day of the Dead. By the time Day of the Dead arrived in the mid-1980s, the horror genre was already loud, bloody, and crowded. But this film did not just want to shock you, it wanted to make you uncomfortable in a deeper way. George A. Romero pushed extreme gore further than ever before, not just for scares, but to strip away any illusion of heroism. Soldiers panic. Scientists argue. Authority collapses. Humanity looks far more monstrous than the dead walking outside. Censors were not ready for that. The graphic violence crossed lines in multiple countries, forcing massive cuts just to secure limited releases. Limbs were torn apart. Flesh was ripped away in lingering detail. These moments were not quick or playful. They were cold, angry, and deliberate. Ratings boards demanded edits, and distributors feared backlash. What audiences first saw was a weakened version of a much harsher film. But the violence was only half the problem. Beneath the blood was a blunt anti-militarism message that hit too close to home during the Cold War era. Soldiers are shown as reckless, cruel, and terrified children with guns. Leadership fails repeatedly. Power becomes noise without purpose. That political edge made studios uneasy and critics dismissive at the time. Years later, restored cuts revealed the full intent. The gore made sense. The anger felt earned. Not flashy, not comforting, just brutal honesty wrapped in horror, finally allowed to exist the way it was meant to. 9. The Howling. When The Howling hit theaters, it quietly rewrote the rules of werewolf horror. This was not the old foggy forest curse story. This was modern, psychological, and deeply cynical. The film tapped into the fear of authority figures, therapists, self-help gurus, and people who claim to heal you while hiding something rotten underneath. That idea alone made censors nervous because the monsters did not hide in shadows. They wore suits, smiles, and professional titles. The real shock came from the transformation scenes. Practical effects pushed far beyond what audiences were used to seeing. Bones stretched, faces warped, bodies reshaped in agonizing detail. These scenes lingered, refusing to cut away. Ratings boards struggled with how intense and realistic it looked, especially compared to earlier monster films that softened the change or hid it off screen. Some territories demanded trims, while others hesitated to release it at all. Behind the scenes, the production was anything but smooth. Budget limits, technical challenges, and time pressure forced constant improvisation. Yet those struggles added grit to the final film. The rough edges made the horror feel raw and unpredictable rather than polished and safe. At release, The Howling was often overshadowed by other creature films, but its influence never faded. Filmmakers studied its effects work, its adult tone, and its refusal to romanticize monsters. Over time, the censored versions faded away, and the full experience finally became accessible. Today, it stands as a turning point that proved monster movies could be smart, unsettling, and deeply uncomfortable without losing their bite. 8. Hellraiser. Hellraiser arrived like a threat wrapped in leather and shadows. This was not horror built on jump scares or simple gore. It explored pain and pleasure as intertwined forces, diving into taboo ideas that many audiences were not prepared to face. The Cenobites were not mindless killers. They were judges, explorers of sensation, and that philosophical edge unsettled moral authorities across the world. Censorship boards reacted fast. The erotic imagery, sadomasochistic themes, and cold presentation of suffering led to heavy cuts in multiple countries. Scenes were trimmed, moments softened, and entire sequences removed to reduce the film's intensity. Even then, distributors worried about backlash, unsure how to market something that felt both intellectual and disturbing. What made Hellraiser more threatening was its seriousness. It did not wink at the audience. It did not apologize. The film treated its mythology with absolute confidence, presenting pain as ritual and desire as a doorway to damnation. That refusal to moralize or explain made censors uneasy. The horror felt deliberate, not accidental. Over time, restored versions revealed how carefully constructed the story really was. The violence served the mythology. The sexuality gave the horror meaning. What once seemed excessive became essential. As the franchise expanded, the original film stood apart as the purest vision, dark, restrained, and unapologetic. Today, Hellraiser is recognized not just as a cult classic, but as one of the most daring horror films ever allowed back into the light. 7. The Thing. When The Thing was released, it felt cruel, cold, and hopeless in a decade obsessed with optimism and clear heroes. This was a horror film built on paranoia. No one could be trusted. Friends turned into threats. Survival meant suspicion. That bleak tone alone put it at odds with mainstream audiences and censorship boards who preferred cleaner, safer scares. The real problem, though, was the body horror. The creature did not just kill. It copied, absorbed, and reshaped human bodies in grotesque detail. Heads sprouted legs, chests opened like mouths, flesh twisted in ways that felt unnatural and deeply upsetting. Several countries demanded bans or heavy censorship, believing the effects were too extreme and disturbing for public viewing. Even in places where it played, critics attacked it as excessive and nihilistic. The production itself was brutal. Cast and crew worked in freezing conditions, often exhausted and frustrated. Practical effects were complex and unreliable, forcing long delays and constant reshoots. That tension bled into the performances, giving the film its raw, uneasy atmosphere. Nothing feels comfortable on screen because almost nothing was comfortable behind it. At the time, the film failed to connect. Audiences rejected its darkness. Studios quietly moved on. But uncensored releases allowed viewers to finally experience the full vision. The paranoia made sense. The gore had purpose. Today, The Thing is praised as one of the greatest horror films ever made, a masterpiece that was simply too honest and too harsh for its own time. 6. Videodrome. Videodrome did not just scare people. It confused them, unsettled them, and made them question reality itself. The film explored how media shapes the human mind, blending technology with flesh in ways that felt dangerous and prophetic. Television was not entertainment here. It was an infection. That idea terrified censors as much as the visuals. The body horror was strange rather than explosive. Human bodies merged with machines. Skin opened to accept videotapes. Hallucinations replaced certainty. This was not violence you could easily cut around. It was conceptual, psychological, and deeply uncomfortable. Many countries demanded heavy edits, while others restricted or delayed release altogether, unsure how to classify something that blurred fantasy and reality so completely. Authorities feared the message. The film suggested that mass media could control thought, behavior, and desire. In an era when television dominated daily life, that accusation felt threatening. The horror was not monsters, it was an influence. That made Videodrome harder to defend and easier to suppress. Initial reactions were harsh. Critics dismissed it as disgusting or incoherent. Audiences struggled to process what they were seeing. But uncensored home video releases slowly changed its reputation. With time, the ideas became clearer. The warnings felt relevant. The strange imagery gained meaning. Today, Videodrome is viewed as prophetic, a disturbing vision of media obsession that censorship failed to silence, only delay. 5. The Fly. The Fly wrapped its horror inside something far more unsettling than a monster story. At its core, it used body horror as a metaphor for disease, decay, and the fear of losing control over your own body. What begins as scientific curiosity slowly turns into physical and emotional collapse. That slow transformation disturbed censors because it felt real. Skin peels, teeth fall out, strength turns into weakness. The horror does not rush, it lingers. The transformation scenes were especially controversial. Instead of quick shocks, the film showed gradual, painful change. Flesh deteriorates in stages, making it impossible to look away. Ratings boards found the realism troubling because it mirrored real-world illness rather than fantasy violence. The scientific tone gave the horror credibility, which made it harder to dismiss as harmless fiction. Some regions demanded edits, while others hesitated to release it without warnings. What unsettled people most was the emotional weight. The film treated mutation like a terminal condition. Love does not save the hero. Intelligence does not stop the decay. That hopelessness challenged expectations of science fiction at the time, which usually promised progress and control. Here, science becomes the cause of destruction. Over time, uncensored versions allowed the full tragedy to be seen. Critics reevaluated the film, recognizing how carefully the effects served the story. Awards followed, and the film gained respect beyond the horror genre. Today, The Fly is remembered not just for its shocking imagery, but for its honesty about fear, loss, and the fragile nature of the human body. 4. RoboCop. RoboCop looked like a violent action film, but beneath the blood and bullets was sharp political satire. The film exaggerated violence to expose corporate greed, media manipulation, and the loss of humanity in a profit-driven system. That exaggeration caused immediate problems. Ratings boards rejected it multiple times, calling the violence excessive and unacceptable for mainstream release. The brutality was deliberate. Executions were long and shocking. Injuries were graphic. Death was treated as a spectacle within the story, to mirror how corporations and media exploit suffering. Censors struggled with this approach because the violence was not glorified in the usual way. It was ugly, repetitive, and uncomfortable. Cuts were demanded to reduce intensity, even though those moments carried the satire's point. Beyond the gore, the film's critique of capitalism made studios uneasy. Corporations are villains. Advertising interrupts tragedy. Human life is treated as expendable. That message felt dangerous in a decade obsessed with consumer culture. The film mocked authority, law enforcement, and privatization without subtlety. When edited versions circulated, the satire lost impact. Later uncensored releases restored the balance between violence and meaning. Audiences finally saw how smart the film really was. What once seemed outrageous became insightful. Today, RoboCop stands as a landmark science fiction film, remembered for its intelligence as much as its intensity, fully appreciated only after censorship loosened its grip. 3. Society. Society hides its censorship story behind satire so sharp it almost feels dangerous. On the surface, it looks like a strange teen horror film, but underneath, it is a vicious attack on class, wealth, and inherited power. The rich are not just corrupt in this world. They are literally monstrous, feeding on those below them while pretending everything is normal. That idea alone made distributors far more uncomfortable than any single violent scene. Unlike many horror films of the era, Society was not crushed only by censorship boards. It was suppressed by its own distributors. Studios did not know how to sell it, feared public backlash, and quietly buried it. Some releases were delayed, others mishandled, and the film barely reached audiences who might have understood it. The problem was not just gore, it was the message. Wealth protects itself. The system is rigged. Outsiders never really get in. When viewers finally saw the full version, the practical effects shocked everyone. Bodies melt together. Social elites merge into a grotesque mass of flesh. The imagery is absurd, disturbing, and impossible to forget. Those scenes were too extreme for mainstream acceptance at the time, even though they served the satire perfectly. Years later, uncensored releases allowed the film to be rediscovered. What once seemed disgusting became meaningful. The horror reflected social anxiety, not cheap shock. Today, Society is recognized as one of the boldest horror satires of the decade, a film that censorship and fear tried and failed to erase. 2. An American Werewolf in London. An American Werewolf in London confused almost everyone when it first appeared. It refused to choose between horror and comedy, blending brutal violence with awkward humor and emotional honesty. That tonal clash made censorship boards unsure how to judge it. Was it a monster movie, a dark comedy, or something else entirely? The answer was all of it, and that made it difficult to control. The transformation scenes caused the biggest reaction. Instead of hiding the change, the film showed it in full light. Bones stretch, muscles tear, pain is unavoidable. There is no magic glow, no quick cutaway. The realism shocked audiences and regulators alike. Some boards wanted trims, others debated restrictions, unsure whether the film crossed lines or redefined them. What made the violence harder to dismiss was its craft. The effects were so convincing that they felt physical and painful. This was not fantasy gore. It was anatomy-driven horror, grounded in movement and sound. That realism pushed boundaries without relying on excess blood. Despite confusion and hesitation, the film survived intact in many regions. Over time, its innovation became undeniable. Awards followed, including recognition for its groundbreaking effects. Critics reassessed its emotional depth and technical brilliance. Today, the film is celebrated for changing how transformations are portrayed, proving horror could be frightening, funny, and tragic all at once, without sacrificing intelligence or impact. 1. Evil Dead 2. Evil Dead 2 looked chaotic, loud, and ridiculous, but beneath the madness was a carefully controlled explosion of style. The film pushed horror into slapstick territory, combining extreme violence with cartoon energy. That blend made censorship especially tricky. The gore was intense, but the tone was playful. Regulators struggled to decide whether laughter made the violence safer or more disturbing. International cuts followed. Scenes were trimmed. Blood was reduced. Some releases softened the impact to avoid backlash. The film's low-budget origins added to the confusion. It looked wild, unpolished, and dangerous, like something that slipped past the rules rather than followed them. That raw energy made authorities nervous. The production itself was frantic. Limited money, relentless schedules, and constant problem-solving shaped the film's identity. Instead of hiding flaws, it leaned into exaggeration. Camera moves became aggressive. Sound effects screamed for attention. The horror became physical comedy, turning fear into endurance. What censorship could not stop was its spread. VHS turned the film into a cult phenomenon. Fans shared it, replayed it, and celebrated its insanity. Over time, uncensored versions restored the full experience. What once seemed excessive became iconic. Today, Evil Dead 2 is recognized as a defining horror comedy, a film that survived cuts, confusion, and doubt to become a classic on its own unhinged terms. So now that the dust has settled and the secrets are out, one thing's clear. The 1980s were way bolder than anyone wants to admit. These movies weren't failures. They were ahead of their time, silenced for being too raw, too strange, or too honest. If you enjoyed digging up these forgotten films, don't stop here. Hit like to show some love, subscribe for more hidden Hollywood stories, and drop a comment telling which censored movie shocked you the most or which one you're watching first. And be honest, how many more banned classics do you think are still hiding in plain sight?